There comes a point in life when you wake up and feel as though you're living the same day over and over again. You brush your teeth, sip your morning coffee, and watch the morning light slip quietly through the window. The routine feels familiar, even comforting, but beneath it, there's a faint hum, a nagging thought you can't shake. Is this all there is? That's how it was for Alex Whitaker. A man not yet old, but not quite young either. He lived in a small, two-bedroom apartment in a quiet neighborhood on the edge of Chicago. From the outside, his life looked unremarkable: steady job, modest possessions, no real complaints, but inside, there was a stillness, a sense of being trapped in a life he didn't quite choose. Alex didn't always feel this way. In his 20s, he'd had dreams of writing a book, traveling the country, maybe even starting his own business. But over time, those dreams had dimmed, replaced by responsibilities, bills, and the quiet weight of practicality. He had settled into life's routine, the way so many of us do, without realizing it was happening. And now, at 30, he felt like a spectator in his own story. One gray autumn morning, Alex decided to take a walk to clear his mind. He often found solace in walking, passing by the rows of brownstones. The rustle of leaves beneath his feet, the distant hum of traffic. It reminded him that life was still moving, even when he felt stuck. That day, as he strolled through a nearby park, Alex noticed a small gathering of people sitting on the grass, their faces turned toward an old man speaking beneath a willow tree. He wasn't shouting or preaching, his voice was calm, steady, the kind that carried wisdom earned through years of living. Alex paused, lingering at the edge of the group, not quite ready to join but too curious to leave. "You're not stuck because of your circumstances," the man was saying. "You're stuck because of your words." Alex frowned, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. Words? What did words have to do with anything? The old man continued, his voice low but clear. "Every day, the words you think, the words you speak, they're shaping your life. Words aren't just sounds, they're spells. They set the boundaries of what you believe is possible." Alex felt something stir inside him, something he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't excitement, not yet. It was more like recognition. The way you feel when you stumble across a memory you'd forgotten. The man's words lingered in Alex's mind long after he left the park. He thought about the things he said to himself, day after day. "I'm too tired. I can't do that. It's too late for me." Simple words, spoken without much thought, but there they were, silent and unyielding, like bricks in a wall he hadn't known he was building. That evening, as Alex sat alone in his living room, the sound of the city muffled through the windows, he began to wonder how many people felt the same way. How many of them had unknowingly trapped themselves with the things they told themselves every day? He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling, the old man's voice echoing in his mind. "Words are spells. Change them, and you change your life." For the first time in a long time, Alex felt a sliver of hope, not the loud, restless hope of youth, but the quiet kind, the kind that sneaks in like a whisper when the world is still. Maybe there was a way out of this invisible cage after all. But first, he would have to learn how to speak to himself differently. In the days after Alex Whitaker heard those words, "Words are spells. Change them, and you change your life," life carried on much the same. But something inside him had begun to shift. It wasn't dramatic, not yet. There were no great revelations or bursts of inspiration. Only small moments of awareness that surfaced like ripples on a still pond. He began to listen, really listen to the way he spoke to himself. At first, it felt strange, like trying to tune into a station that had always been playing quietly in the background. But the more he listened, the more he noticed how often his own words betrayed him. "I'm not smart enough for that. It's too late to start over. What's the point?" They were small thoughts, harmless on the surface, but Alex began to see them differently, like rust eating away at the foundation of his life. Slow and silent until one day you realize everything is crumbling. One evening, as the soft glow of the sunset spilled across his small kitchen table, Alex found himself staring at an old notebook buried under a pile of unopened mail. It was something he'd started years ago, back when writing still felt possible, back when his thoughts were bright and eager to spill onto the page. He flipped it open, the spine creaking, and read the words scrawled across the first line. "Today is the first day of the rest of my life." It felt almost like a joke now, sitting there in his empty kitchen with the clock ticking loudly on the wall. But Alex noticed something else. He'd written it in bold letters, with a sense of conviction that he could almost feel through the faded ink. Back then, he believed those words. They were more than just a motivational phrase, they were a promise to himself. He closed the notebook and sat still for a long time, the room around him growing dim as the evening shadows stretched across the walls. Where had that conviction gone? When had he stopped believing in promises he made to himself? The next morning, on a whim, Alex wandered into a second-hand bookstore he hadn't visited in years. The place smelled of paper and old wood, the kind of scent that makes you feel like you've stepped back in time. As he browsed the crowded shelves, his fingers grazing the spines of forgotten books, a title caught his eye, The Power of Words. It was an unassuming little book, worn edges, faded gold lettering, but something about it called to him. He pulled it from the shelf, flipping it open to a random page. Every word you speak, every thought you repeat, becomes part of your reality. Words are vibrations, and like ripples on water, they touch everything around them. If you change your words, you change your life. Alex read the passage twice, then a third time. He'd always thought of words as tools for communication, what you say when you need to order a coffee or explain yourself to someone who doesn't understand. But this was something else. This was the idea that words were alive, that they carried weight, intention, and energy. He bought the book for a few dollars and walked out into the bright autumn afternoon, the crisp air sharp in his lungs. As he made his way home, he thought of his grandmother, a quiet woman who used to say things like, "Be careful with your words, Alex. They have long memories." Back then, he dismissed it as something old folks said, a piece of advice handed down without much thought. But now, standing on the edge of middle age, he understood. Words did have memories. They lived inside you, like echoes of the past, shaping how you saw yourself and the world. That night, Alex sat at his kitchen table, the book open in front of him. He picked up a pen and began to write a list, not a to-do list, not a plan for his life, but a list of the words he caught himself saying over and over again. Words like, can't, too late, not good enough. He stared at the list for a long time. These words were not just thoughts, they were threads woven into the fabric of his life, pulling tight every time he tried to stretch beyond the invisible boundaries he'd created for himself. Alex picked up the pen again and wrote a second list. This one was different. Instead of what he believed, he wrote what he wanted to believe. I can learn. It's never too late. I am capable. The words felt strange at first, like wearing a pair of shoes that didn't quite fit. But he decided to say them out loud anyway, quietly, to no one but himself. I am capable. It's never too late. For a long time, nothing happened. The room was still, the only sound the soft tick of the clock on the wall. But deep down, in a place Alex couldn't quite name, something shifted, like the faint stirring of a breeze before a storm. The old man's words came back to him then, steady and clear. Words are spells. Change them, and you change your life. And for the first time in a long time, Alex felt like he'd just taken the first step out of a cage he hadn't known he was in. It's a strange thing, noticing your own thoughts. Most people go through life never really hearing them, those words that bounce around in the mind like shadows against a wall. But once you begin to pay attention, you realize how loud they are, how constant, and, most importantly, how unkind they can be. For Alex Whitaker, it was like uncovering an old, broken machine buried deep inside him, a language factory, endlessly churning out thoughts and words without his permission. And, for the most part, those words were far from helpful. At work, sitting in front of his computer, he caught himself muttering under his breath, "This is pointless." On the train ride home, when he glanced at someone laughing with friends, he heard the whisper, "Why don't you have that?" Even in quiet moments, brushing his teeth, watching the news, there was always a voice, always a commentary that never seemed to have anything good to say. The more he listened, the more Alex realized how often his thoughts worked against him. They didn't encourage him to grow, to reach, to try. Instead, they made him small, convincing him to stay where he was safe, stuck, and silent. One afternoon, after a particularly dull meeting, Alex decided to take the long way home. He wandered through the city streets, the steady rhythm of his shoes tapping against the pavement. The air was crisp, and the leaves tumbled around him in a dance that only autumn knows how to perform. As he passed a small cafe, he noticed a woman sitting by the window. She was older, Perhaps in her 70s, with a face carved by time and experience. There was something serene about her. The way she held her cup of tea as though it was the most important thing in the world. She was reading a book, one of those thick novels with yellowed pages, and smiling to herself as if she'd just uncovered a private joke hidden between the lines. Alex couldn't help but slow his pace. For a moment, he wondered what it felt like to live that way, to save her life. To carry the kind of peace that only comes when you've stopped fighting with yourself. That evening, back in his apartment, Alex picked up The Power of Words again. He turned to a chapter titled, The Stories We Tell Ourselves. The mind is a machine, and words are its fuel. Over time, the words you repeat, whether spoken aloud or whispered in thought, become the stories you live by. These stories shape who you are, what you believe, and what you think is possible. The sentence hit him like a hammer. Alex sat back, staring at the page. Stories. That's all they were, stories he had told himself for so long that he'd mistaken them for truth. The story of not being good enough. The story of it being too late. The story of life being something that happened to him, rather than something he could create. He thought about his father. A man of few words who had spent his life working long hours in a steel mill. Life is hard, his father used to say. You just do your best and hope it's enough. Alex had always taken those words to heart, letting them shape the way he saw the world. Gritty, unforgiving, a place where dreams were luxuries no one could afford. But now, sitting in the stillness of his living room, Alex wondered if his father had been wrong. Or maybe not wrong, exactly, just limited. After all, a man who spends his life surrounded by fire and metal sees the world differently than one who has the luxury of looking for beauty. The mind is a machine, he repeated quietly to himself, tracing the words on the page. That night, Alex pulled out the notebook he'd rediscovered days before. He opened it to a blank page and wrote 2 questions at the top. 1. What stories have I been telling myself? 2. What stories do I want to live instead? The first list came easily, as though the words had been waiting for him. I'm not smart enough to start over. Life is too short to take risks. People like me don't get second chances. But the second list, that was harder. He sat there for a long time, tapping his pen against the paper, trying to imagine what life would feel like without those old stories holding him back. Finally, he began to write. I can learn anything I set my mind to. It's never too late to live fully. I am worthy of happiness and new beginnings. The words felt strange, almost foreign, as though they belonged to someone else. But as he looked at them, written in his own shaky handwriting, Alex felt something stir inside him, an unfamiliar, cautious kind of hope. The next morning, Alex tried something new. As he stood in front of the mirror, his toothbrush dangling from his mouth, he whispered one of the new phrases out loud. I am worthy of happiness. It sounded silly at first, like he was trying to trick himself. But he said it again, and then again. I am worthy of happiness. He didn't feel different, not right away, but he noticed that the old voice, the one that liked to say, "What's the point?" was quieter than usual. That was enough for now. As Alex left his apartment and stepped out into the cool morning air, he realized something simple but profound. The stories we tell ourselves are not set in stone. They can be rewritten, word by word, day by day, until, little by little, they become something new. And for the first time in years, Alex believed that maybe, just maybe, his story was far from over. There is a certain quietness in old habits, a weight that settles around you like a heavy coat on a winter's day. You wear it because it's familiar, because it's yours, even though it doesn't keep you warm anymore. Alex Whitaker understood this now. For weeks, he had been unraveling the invisible threads of his thoughts, listening to the words he spoke to himself, learning to replace them with ones that lifted instead of weighed him down. It was slow work, the kind that doesn't make headlines but leaves its mark in quieter ways. The first steps of change are always quiet. After all, like the faint crack of ice before a thaw. But the world does not make change easy. It pulls you back into what it knows, testing whether you really mean it when you whisper to yourself, I am capable, or, it's never too late. Alex learned this lesson on a particularly cold afternoon in late November. He had taken a day off work, a small rebellion against the endless drone of routine. He spent the morning sorting through old papers, clearing out drawers filled with bills, forgotten notes, and memories he'd been too busy to confront. There was something satisfying about it, like clearing space not just in his apartment but in his mind. At the bottom of one drawer, he found a photograph he hadn't seen in years. It was of him and his best friend, Paul, sitting on the hood of an old Chevy Impala. The two of them were grinning, faces sunburned, windblown, and alive. They'd taken that road trip straight out of high school. Two boys with empty wallets and wide-open dreams. Alex traced his finger along the edges of the photo, feeling a pang of something he couldn't quite name. Where had that version of himself gone? The one who believed life was an adventure? The one who laughed easily and didn't measure his days in paychecks or deadlines? He put the photo aside and stared out the window, the pale sun casting long shadows across the city below. For the first time in weeks, the old voice crept back into his thoughts. You let it all slip away. It was an insidious whisper, sharp and familiar, the kind that makes you want to turn away from yourself. Alex tried to ignore it, but the words settled into him, pulling at the edges of his resolve. Later that afternoon, Alex met Paul for coffee. They hadn't seen each other in months, though neither of them would have admitted how long it had really been. Paul had aged differently. He carried the same easy smile, but there was a tiredness behind his eyes that hadn't been there before. Life had touched them both, in different ways. So, what's new? Paul asked, stirring sugar into his cup. Alex hesitated, unsure of how to explain what had been happening. I've been trying something different, he said finally. Paul raised an eyebrow. Different how? Alex chose his words carefully. I'm paying attention to how I talk to myself. The things I say in my head. You know, trying to change the way I think. Paul let out a small laugh, though not unkindly. You sound like one of those motivational tapes. Maybe, Alex said quietly, but it's helping. Paul shrugged, his expression softening. Hey, whatever gets you through the day. That was the trouble with explaining change to other people. They didn't always understand it. And sometimes, their misunderstanding could make you doubt yourself. As they sat there, the old voice stirred again. You're wasting your time. Walking home that evening, Alex felt the weight of the day pressing down on him. The cold wind bit at his face, and the streets were crowded with people hurrying to get somewhere, as if the whole world were in a rush. It would have been easy, so easy to let the old habits win. To sink back into the familiar hum of negativity. To let himself believe that nothing could really change. But then, as he waited at a crosswalk, he remembered something from the power of words. Every time you speak, you choose. You can speak a word of limitation, or a word of freedom. The choice is yours. It struck him, standing there under the fading sky, that he did have a choice. He always had. The old thoughts, the old words, they would come back, again and again, but he didn't have to listen to them. He didn't have to believe them. When he got home, Alex did something that felt almost ridiculous. He stood in front of his bathroom mirror, the light buzzing faintly overhead, and looked himself in the eye. His reflection stared back, tired but determined. I am not wasting my time, he said out loud. The words felt strange in his mouth, but he said them again, and then a third time. I am not wasting my time. He didn't shout. He didn't cry. He simply spoke, calmly and clearly, as though stating a fact to the universe. For the first time in his life, Alex understood something important. Change doesn't happen all at once. It happens in the small moments when you choose a different word, a different thought, a different response. It happens when you face the voice in your head and speak back to it, not with anger, but with quiet certainty. That night, as Alex sat by his window with a cup of tea, he thought about the photograph he'd found earlier. He wasn't that boy anymore, the one on the hood of the Chevy, grinning at the world. But maybe that was okay. Maybe he didn't need to be. Because now, he was someone else, someone who knew that words mattered. That change was possible, and that life, even in its quietest moments, was still an adventure waiting to unfold. There is a moment in every journey when the path becomes clearer but the destination still feels far away, where doubt begins to settle like fog. Change, after all, isn't always visible. It doesn't shout its presence, it whispers, unfolding so quietly that you begin to wonder if anything is happening at all. That's where Alex Whitaker found himself. The days had grown colder, the air sharper, as December crept into the city. Each morning, he woke with purpose, a new habit of speaking words of possibility to himself, but there were still moments when the old voices called to him. Words of doubt, words of fear, words that felt like ghosts, lingering in corners of his mind. One evening, as Alex walked home through the fading winter light, He stopped at a small grocery store to buy tea. It was the kind of place that felt older than the rest of the city-worn wooden floors. Shelves stocked with brands that had long since disappeared from the larger stores. Behind the counter stood the owner, an elderly man with a stooped back and hands that shook slightly as he worked the register. Alex had seen him before, but tonight, something made him pause. Maybe it was the look on the old man's face, a quiet weariness, as though life had been both a companion and a burden. "Long day?" Alex asked, offering a small smile as he placed the tea on the counter. The man looked up, surprised, as if no one had asked him that in a long time. "They're all long these days," he replied, his voice soft and worn. "But I don't mind. It's a blessing to have something to do. Isn't it?" Alex nodded, watching as the man carefully placed the box of tea into a paper bag. "You know," the man said suddenly, his eyes glinting with something unexpected, "I used to tell myself I couldn't do this anymore. That I was too old. Too tired. But one day, I stopped." Alex raised an eyebrow. "Stopped what?" "Stopped telling myself I couldn't." The man replied, "I realized my own words were the heaviest things I carried. So I set them down." For a moment, the two men stood in silence, one old, one younger, but both carrying the weight of their own thoughts. Alex felt something shift inside him, like a key turning in a long-forgotten lock. That night, Alex sat at his kitchen table, the small bag of tea beside him. The old man's words echoed in his mind. "I realized my own words were the heaviest things I carried." He picked up The Power of Words again, flipping through its worn pages until he found a passage he had underlined weeks before. "Words carry energy, vibrations that ripple out and touch everything around you. Speak love, and you create love. Speak fear, and you strengthen fear." Energy. Vibrations. It was a concept Alex had never given much thought to before. He had always seen words as tools for communication, nothing more. But now, he wondered, what if words really did carry weight? What if they left marks on the world, the way wind leaves patterns in the sand? He closed the book and sat quietly, listening to the soft hum of the radiator. Outside, the city was still alive, horns in the distance. Footsteps on the sidewalk below, but in his little apartment, there was peace. For the first time, Alex allowed himself to feel the words he had been practicing. "I am capable. I am worthy of happiness. It's never too late." He didn't just say them this time, he let them sink in, imagining each one as a small ripple moving outward, touching his thoughts, his body, his life. The next morning, Alex woke to sunlight spilling through the window, brighter than it had been in days. As he stood in the quiet of his kitchen, brewing the tea he'd bought, he noticed something surprising. His shoulders felt lighter, his thoughts quieter. It wasn't that everything had changed overnight. The world was still the same, and so was he. But there was a difference, a small, almost imperceptible shift, like the first sign of spring hidden beneath the snow. Later that afternoon, Alex found himself back in the park where he'd first heard the old man speak. The willow tree stood tall and bare now, its branches swaying in the wind like long, slender fingers. Nearby, a group of children were playing, their laughter cutting through the cold air. Alex watched them for a while, their joy so simple, so unburdened. He couldn't remember the last time he'd felt that free, when his thoughts didn't hold him down, when life was something to be experienced rather than endured. One of the children, a little girl in a red coat, broke away from the group and ran toward her mother, shouting, "I can do it! I can do it!" Her words hung in the air, bright and full of energy. And Alex couldn't help but smile. He wondered when it was that people stopped saying things like that, when the words, "I can," turned into, "I can't." As he walked home, Alex thought about the language of his own life, the words that had shaped him, held him, and, in some ways, broken him. But now, he understood something important. Just as words had the power to trap him, they also had the power to set him free. That evening, he stood in front of the mirror again, just as he had the night before. His reflection stared back at him, tired but steady. "I can do this," he said softly. It wasn't loud or triumphant. It wasn't something you'd hear in a movie. But it was real. And in that moment, Alex realized that words, spoken with intention, carry a kind of quiet magic. They don't change the world all at once, but they change you. They move through you like a current, shifting the way you see yourself and the possibilities that lie ahead. And maybe, Alex thought, that was enough. Some truths in life are so simple that we miss them. We get used to looking far ahead, searching for answers in the distance, when often, the answers are right there, close enough to touch. For Alex Whittaker, this realization came quietly, as most important ones do when he wasn't searching for it at all. The winter deepened, the city streets were covered in frost, and the days grew shorter. Alex moved through his routines like a man who had discovered the value of small steps. He was no longer in a rush, no longer resentful of time or himself. Instead, he observed his life carefully, as though seeing it for the first time. It began with a moment at the grocery store. Alex had been waiting in line, his basket holding only a loaf of bread, some eggs, and a carton of milk. The cashier, a young man no older than 20, looked tired, his shoulders slumped, his movements slow and mechanical. "Long day?" Alex asked, almost without thinking. The boy looked up, his expression startled. "Yeah," he said, "feels like it never ends." Alex nodded, understanding. "I've been there," he replied softly. Something shifted in the boy's face, a brief flash of connection, like he'd been seen in a way that few people cared to see him. "Thanks," he said, as though the word carried more weight than it usually did. As Alex walked home, he thought about that moment. It wasn't much, a few words exchanged in line, but it lingered in him like a ripple spreading across a still pond. How many small interactions do we rush through in a day? How many people do we pass by without noticing? The world, Alex realized, was made up of moments like these, ordinary yet full of meaning, waiting for someone to see them. That evening, Alex sat by his window, a notebook open on the table in front of him. He had started writing again, not long, sprawling pages like he'd once dreamed of, but small observations, words, thoughts, things he noticed about his days that he might otherwise have missed. He wrote about the grocery store clerk. He wrote about the sound of footsteps on the frozen sidewalk, how they reminded him of the ticking of a clock. He wrote about the way sunlight streamed through his window in the late afternoon, turning the dust into something beautiful. Life happens in small moments, he wrote. We miss them when we're not paying attention. It was a quiet realization, but it changed the way Alex moved through the world. He no longer rushed through his mornings, his coffee growing cold as he scrolled through his phone. Instead, he sat by the window and watched the sky shift from gray to pale blue. He paid attention to the way his breath fogged the glass when he exhaled, a reminder that he was alive. When he walked to work, he looked at people, not just their faces, but their stories. The man in the coat patched at the elbows, the woman who hummed to herself as she waited for the bus, the boy skateboarding down the empty street, his laughter rising like a song. One Sunday, Alex returned to the park where the old man had spoken weeks before. The willow tree stood stark and bare against the pale winter sky, its branches swaying like long, tired arms. The group that had gathered there before was gone, but Alex didn't mind. He sat on a bench and closed his eyes, letting the cold air fill his lungs. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked. A child called out to her mother. The wind whispered through the dry grass, carrying secrets that only silence could hear. When Alex opened his eyes, he felt a calm he hadn't known in years, a sense of being present, fully and completely, in the moment he was living. It wasn't extraordinary, it wasn't dramatic, but it was real. That evening, Alex thought about something he'd read in The Power of Words. Observation is creation. The more carefully you observe your world, the more you begin to see its possibilities. For so long, Alex had lived as though life was happening to him, a series of events outside his control. But now, he understood that he was part of it, connected to it in ways he hadn't seen before. Every word he spoke, every thought he held, every moment he chose to notice, each one was like a brushstroke on the canvas of his life. He didn't have to rush anymore. He didn't have to fix everything all at once. The act of noticing, of observing, was enough. Before going to bed, Alex stood in front of the mirror again, a quiet ritual he had grown accustomed to. His reflection looked back at him, familiar but somehow different, as though his face had softened, his eyes a little brighter. "I am here," he said quietly, his voice steady. It was such a simple phrase, but it felt profound. He was here, in this moment, alive, awake, paying attention, and for the first time in a long time. That was enough. As Alex Whittaker grew into his quiet changes, he began to notice something extraordinary. The world around him hadn't changed, but his place in it had. It wasn't dramatic, there were no flashes of light. No miraculous moments of sudden transformation. Instead, there was a subtle shift. Like the way the sky softens after a storm. He wasn't walking faster or moving louder. But something in him felt clearer. Lighter. As though he had begun to set down a weight he'd carried for far too long. The first time he truly realized this was on an ordinary Tuesday. Alex had taken the same route to work for years. He knew every crack in the pavement. Every street lamp that flickered. Every window display that changed with the seasons. It was the kind of path a person stops seeing after a while. Turning into nothing more than a backdrop to the grind of routine. But that morning, something caught his eye. A boy. No older than 10. Standing on the corner with a violin tucked beneath his chin. His shoes were too big. And his coat looked like it belonged to someone else. But his hands were steady as he drew the bow across the strings. The sound that poured out was raw and imperfect. But there was something about it, something honest. Something real. It stopped Alex mid-step. He looked around and noticed that no one else was paying attention. People hurried past, heads down, the music slipping through the cracks of their awareness like water through their fingers. Alex stood there, hands in his coat pockets, and listened. For the first time in years. He wasn't in a rush to be anywhere. He let the music settle around him like a blanket. The boy's expression so focused. So determined, it made Alex's chest tighten. When the song ended, Alex walked over and pulled a few crumpled bills from his wallet. "You're good," he said softly, dropping them into the open violin case. The boy looked up, surprised. "Thank you, sir." Alex paused, meeting the boy's eyes. "Don't stop playing." The boy nodded, a small smile curling the corners of his mouth. And Alex walked on. It was a small thing, a fleeting moment, but it stayed with him. The music, the boy's determination, the fact that most people hadn't even heard it. Life doesn't wait for us to notice it. Alex thought later as he sipped his evening tea. The memory lingering like a song you can't forget. You have to choose to listen. That night, Alex thought about something he had read weeks earlier in The Power of Words. The act of observation collapses infinite possibilities into a single reality. What you choose to see, what you choose to speak, shapes what comes next. He hadn't understood it at the time. Quantum physics wasn't something he had ever considered. Particles and waves and fields of possibilities seemed far removed from the life of a man like him. But now, he began to see what it meant. Life wasn't a straight line. It wasn't something that happened to him while he stood still. It was a series of choices, of moments, of words and thoughts that shaped what came next. The possibilities were always there waiting, shifting like waves, but they didn't take shape until he chose to see them. To reach for them, to believe in them. The next day, Alex decided to visit his old friend, Paul. It had been weeks since their last meeting. And Alex couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to see him, not just out of obligation but out of something deeper. Something that told him time was precious. Paul lived in a small house on the edge of the city. The kind with a sagging porch and a front yard full of leaves no one bothered to rake. When Paul answered the door, he looked thinner than Alex remembered. His face lined with something heavier than age. "I wasn't expecting you," Paul said, stepping aside to let Alex in. The two men sat in the living room, a football game playing softly on the TV. Though neither of them was watching, they talked about nothing for a while: weather, work, the way the city felt busier than it used to. But after a long silence, Paul looked at Alex and said, "Do you ever feel like you're running out of time?" The question caught Alex off guard. "All the time," he said finally. Paul nodded, his gaze fixed on the worn carpet beneath his feet. "Me too." Alex thought about the boy with the violin, about the quiet music that no one else had stopped to hear. "We can't stop time," he said softly, "but maybe we can notice it. Maybe that's enough." Paul looked up, his expression unreadable, and for a moment, the two men just sat there in the quiet of the room. The game on TV forgotten. That evening, as Alex walked home under a darkening sky, he thought about how easy it was to let life pass by unnoticed. Most people lived on autopilot, repeating the same words, the same thoughts, until their lives became smaller than they were meant to be. But he was learning slowly, stubbornly, that noticing mattered. Noticing the sound of music on a busy street corner. Noticing the words he whispered to himself when no one else was listening. Noticing the moments that felt like possibilities instead of limitations. When he reached his apartment, Alex stood in front of the mirror one last time. It had become a ritual now, not out of vanity but out of necessity. A way of reminding himself that he was still here. Still trying. "I see you," he said softly, looking at his reflection. "I see you. And you are enough." It wasn't loud. It wasn't perfect. But it was real. And in that moment, Alex understood something he hadn't before. Life wasn't about fixing everything at once. It was about showing up, day after day, and choosing to see the world, to see yourself as full of possibility. It was about collapsing the wave of what could be into what is. One small, deliberate choice at a time. For the first time in years, Alex believed it. Winter gave way to spring slowly. As it often does in the city, the gray slush on the sidewalks disappeared, replaced by puddles that reflected glimpses of the pale blue sky. Buds began to gather on the bare branches of trees, hesitant but certain, like whispered promises of life returning. Alex Whitaker noticed it all. He noticed the way sunlight began lingering a little longer on his kitchen table in the mornings. He noticed the hum of conversation on the bus. How laughter, once distant and unremarkable, now sounded like music. He noticed how his own shoulders felt lighter, as though some invisible burden had finally fallen away. Change had happened quietly. It always did. One Sunday afternoon, Alex returned to the park. The willow tree was no longer bare, its branches were dotted with green, their tips swaying gently in the warm breeze. Families spread blankets on the grass. Couples walked slowly, hands intertwined. Children shrieked with the kind of joy only they could muster. Alex sat on the same bench he had sat on months earlier, back when the air was colder and his thoughts were heavier. Today, though, there was a difference, not in the world around him, but in the way he saw it. He pulled a notebook from his bag, the same one he had started all those weeks ago. Its pages were worn now, smudged with ink and fingerprints, filled with thoughts he might have been too afraid to write once. At the top of a blank page, Alex wrote a single question. What story do I want to live? For a long time, he didn't write anything else. He sat still, watching the world around him, letting the question linger in his mind. It was easy to let the past answer for him, to fall back on the old words and old beliefs that had kept him in place. But today, he didn't let it. Instead, he picked up his pen and began to write. I want to live a story where small things matter, where I notice the sunlight and the music and the people I pass by every day. I want to live a story where words are tools, where I speak with kindness and intention, to others and to myself. I want to believe in possibilities, in second chances, in the idea that it's never too late to begin again. He paused, the sound of the pen scratching against paper grounding him in the moment. I want to live a story where I choose how it's written, where I decide the words, the chapters, the ending. I want to be awake in my life, fully here, fully alive. Alex stopped writing and leaned back, letting the words settle in. They weren't perfect. They didn't need to be. For the first time, he understood that life wasn't about waiting for the right moment, or the right answers, or the perfect version of himself. It was about choosing, every day, to show up and write the story anyway. As the afternoon light softened, Alex noticed an older man walking slowly along the path. His back was slightly stooped, and his hands were tucked into the pockets of his coat. When the man reached the willow tree, he paused and looked up, as though greeting an old friend. Alex watched him for a moment, recognizing something familiar in the way the man carried himself, the weight of years. Yes, but also a quiet kind of peace. Suddenly, the man turned and looked in Alex's direction. Their eyes met, and the older man smiled, a simple, knowing smile. Alex found himself smiling back. For a brief moment, nothing else existed, just the two of them, separated by years but connected by something unspoken. Then the man nodded, turned, and continued on his way, disappearing down the path. Alex stayed there for a while longer, listening to the wind rustling the leaves and the sound of children playing in the distance. It struck him how simple it all was, how the smallest moments carried the greatest meaning if you only chose to notice them. When he finally stood and began walking home, he felt the same words turning over in his mind, steady and clear. This is your story. Write it well. That night, as Alex stood in front of the mirror for the last time in this quiet, unspoken chapter of his life, he looked at himself not with judgment or frustration, but with acceptance. He saw a man who had carried his own weight for years, and who had learned, slowly, how to set it down. He took a deep breath and spoke softly to his reflection. The words steady and intentional. I choose my words. I choose my life. The face looking back at him wasn't younger. Nor was it untouched by time. But it was clearer now. Lighter. As though something new had taken root behind his eyes. Alex turned off the light and stood in the stillness of his apartment. The faint hum of the city floating through the window. Somewhere in the distance, someone was playing a violin. The notes carrying across the night air gentle. Imperfect, but full of life. And Alex listened, knowing that this, too, was part of the story he was choosing to write.